Okay, good, good, good. Awesome. All right. With that, we're going to move next to just the objectives for today. In this particular session, again, we're going to talk. Last week we talked about the physical symptoms, the virulence factors, some of the epidemiology of Bacillus anthracis. So today now we're going to move on into the gram negatives, and they tend to be a little harder to work with and to recognize. So we're going to cover Brucella, Francisella, and Yersinia in detail, but that does leave the Burkholderias and some of the other minor organisms. We will talk about those as well, but not in a case study form. What we're going to do again is list the agencies in which to contact when you're not able to rule out an organism. We'll be covering a few of the hazardous organisms that really are not considered select agents. Select agent meaning something that could be used against us in a COVID event, and but yet we find them in the community, such as Neisseria meningitidis, and so we want to discuss those as well because they are a danger to you in the laboratory as well. We want to explain the risks of performing some of the more rapid tests for influenza, for COVID, for any of these organisms, basically because that's a risk again to us in the laboratory. And then we're going to talk a little bit about why novel pathogens emerge. Why did COVID hit when it did, and why is it spread internationally, where some other pathogens simply do not. So we will investigate those kinds of things. Trying to get to the next page. So here we go with case study 2. Now, if you remember, what our first recommendation is that before you even open that plate, that you would literally review your requisition, look on the computer and find out what information you can about it, because it does tell us a lot. So we have a patient here who is a 3-year-old male. And so I'm going to open it up to you. Please tell me what you see. Apparently the patient has been admitted, but tell me what you see as some trigger points. So starting with that first box that goes through the patient history themselves. The doctor's information may not help us, but the fact that this patient was admitted and is in Peds ICU is a good hint. What else? Yes, thank you. We have an answer that the hamster bite on the finger might be a good trigger point, and yes, it would be. Now, that's not necessarily something that you normally see in your laboratory reports. Again, remember last week I asked you to talk to your supervisor to see if there's a way you can literally set up your screen so you do see patient history, that you do see the diagnosis, because I think half the time the systems have it available. They certainly have it in Epic or whatever hospital information system you're using. However, to bring that to the laboratory side, it's just a matter of a click or two to get it to show on your screen. They don't like to put it on because they feel maybe it will be too, I don't know, it fills your screen up and they want you to see only the things that are pertinent to microbiology. But in reality, those very things are very helpful and necessary when you're talking about trigger points. Now, there is one other thing on that first box, if you can tell me what it might be. Yes, thank you, Tracy. It's the fever and lymphadenopathy and malaise that is possible trigger point as well. So now I recommend that you go down into the second part of the screen, the second box, that gives you your accession number. What's really important, it tells you what kind of specimen it is. So knowing it's a tissue, what do you think about that? What first thing comes to your mind about tissue specimens? Ah, well, I will help there. So think about it. Tissue is sterile. This is not just well, it says aerobic, anaerobic. I don't think this means that it was a swab. It shouldn't be anyway when you're talking tissue. Hopefully, actual tissue was submitted to the laboratory and it was ground and then plated both aerobically and anaerobically. So the source of the tissue is also important. If you think about it, that left axillary lymph node, what organisms are passed via the lymphatic system? Obviously, this organism has gone systemic, possibly intercellular, and therefore that's why it has gone to the lymphatic system. All right. Now, what is also important are a couple other things in box 2. So 2 more things. Does anybody pick up on the other 2 items? Feel free to type in. Take a wild guess. Yes, also augmentin failure, so some sort of treatment failure, exactly. And then the final thing is, I'll share that with you. Always be sure to look at the time. This particular culture was collected at 1500 and then received at 16 something. So in other words, it was received in a very timely manner. And now we want to compare it with the last box underneath. So the culture itself then, what the first reading came on the 20th, and it says no growth. That in itself is a trigger point as well. And yet on the 21st, we do see that there was tiny gray and whitish opaque-like colonies. One other trigger point on here, have you noticed anything else that in that last box that might be a trigger point? Take a look at your gram stain result. And this is even before you've opened your plate. What was seen in that gram stain, that original gram stain that was read the night before? Don't be shy. What is, yeah, it's NOS, meaning no organisms seen. That's a good point. It is something that I guess if you don't see any growth at day 1 and you don't see any organism, you're not normally concerned. It's a sterile body site. If there's really nothing there, it might not show. So when indeed at 48 hours that you recognize that there is small growth. That's very significant. So thank you all for helping there. With that, we're going to move on and talk a little bit more about some of those trigger points. Of course, the trigger points were seen as tiny growth at 48 hours, and it was seen both on the blood and chocolate. It may not have been written on your requisition, but you as a microbiologist on that bench then notices the tiny growth, would make that documentation that it was growth on your blood and chocolate. And you know, I highly recommend that that kind of detail is added to your worksheets, because even if you're not on the bench the next day, that's extremely helpful for the person working on next. And so we went ahead and considered the fact that there was no organism seen on that direct gram stain and slow growth. Obviously, what's going to be your next step? And that would be to re-gram stain that culture. But what are you going to do even before you gram it? You're going to take it into the biosafety cabinet, hopefully. These trigger points are gnawing at you now. You should be able to realize that this, only in the fact that it's a slow grower. If you have no growth at 24 hours, then definitely consider doing all workup, including any manipulation to the plate, and not even really opening it up until you get into that biosafety cabinet. And that's just the hardest thing to remember. I think that people may be suspicious, but they just think it's Haemophilus or something like that, and then they do the gram stain, and then they start realizing what they have. So even with the gram stain, it is highly recommended that you do all the workup possible in that biosafety cabinet. All right, so this is what you're seeing in your gram stain. And sorry, I can't make it any more focused for you, but I would like everyone on their own to go ahead and enter what you think this gram stain would have read out. How would you have called or interpreted this gram stain? So this, and keep in mind, this is a gram stain done in the biosafety cabinet, and from that tiny growth, you are simply re-gramming it, because in the original gram stain, it was no organism seen. So tell me what you think this is. And you think about it, okay, so maybe you think that this looks like dust. But is it dust because you had something, you had growth? It's very slow and pinpoint, but it was there today and not there yesterday. So you have something growing, right? So is it dust? Or what do you think? So just take a wild guess. What would be your first inclination? Thank you. Yes. Definitely a gram-negative coccobacilli. That's a good point. So I've always learned that if these organisms are so hard to read that you cannot tell if it's a rod or coccobacilli, to play it safe and call it a coccobacilli, because you honestly can't see the difference. Yes, it does look like grains of sand, or maybe cellular junk. It's not a blood culture, so there shouldn't be a blood culture or blood cell broken blood cell remnants there. So yes, thank you. Gram-negative coccobacilli. Do we have any reason to question the gram stain? Do we have any question or a reason to think that this might be a gram positive? Probably not. This is only one field, but as you should with any gram stain, you should look at least 25 fields and systematically go through all your fields. And that way you can get a good idea across the board how your entire gram stain stained. So if it was all gram negative, then I think you can feel very confident that it was a gram negative rod. However, if part of the slide was gram positive, part of it was not, yeah, then you might want to question it and repeat your gram stain. All right. So the next thing you'll want to do is you'll want to go into your bench guide. And if you remember, we talked about this particular bench guide, which is the Nebraska Public Health Laboratory version. This is a much more simple flowchart methodology or LRN methodology because it is broken down in only the biochemicals that most laboratories would have. So I encourage everyone that when you start thinking about what organisms might be suspicious, that you would go to the summary page. Remember, if you have that with you, you can look on page summary page 1, and that's your gram positive rods and your gram negative rods. But we don't have a gram negative rod. It was too tiny. So then you would want to look upon this page on our slide, and it's called the gram negative coccobacilli or small gram negative rod page. The reason I want you to look at this specific page, because what it's going to tell you is it's going to tell you what organisms you need to be concerned about. So if you think about these 3 organisms, and if you're able to rule those out, then I would say you would feel confident enough to work on this in the open bench. So you might want to start with some of the flow charts on each one of these. Look them through and see what organisms or what biochemical reactions you need to do. But let's talk about, before we go on, let's go back to the gram stain. We want to even compare on this summary page the differences between the gram stains for the Francisella, the Brucella, and the Burkholderia malleii, because those are all the small coccobacilli or very small gram negative rods. Please tell me if my arrow is working, my cursor. Can you see it circling in the top left-hand box? Please go ahead and type in yes if you can see that. Perfect. Okay. All right. So on the Francisella side, if we were to consider Francisella, it should be really tiny, a pleomorphic, poorly stained gram negative coccobacillus. And there's even a size there. I don't know if many of you have some sort of a scope that can measure, but if you needed to, you could use that as a base point. And here it says mostly single cells. Okay, mostly single cells. They must not lie in pairs or angles at each other. They mostly single cells, but that's even hard to tell, right? You have a situation where it's so small, you're just not really sure. Now, Brucella, on the other end, if you go to the second box down, the small gram negative coccobacillus is also faintly staining, It says small versus tiny, so maybe it's just a little bit larger, and that's proven here in that particular size range. However, what's so notable about the gram stain of brucella, it says here, may be slow to decolorize, can appear as a gram-positive cocci. So did we see that in our gram stain? No, we didn't. We felt pretty comfortable that it truly was a gram-negative rod. And then last but not least, the Burkholderia organism. Here it says it's a straight or slightly curved, small gram-negative rod or coccobacilli. May have rounded ends, wavy sides, may be in parallel bundles. Well, I go back to think about our gram stain. What our first thought probably was is this is so tiny, I can't tell if it has rounded ends or if it has wavy sides or if it's lying in bundles to each other. So you might already, even at this point, start having some real suspicions about what organism this is, but you cannot go by colony morphology or even for that matter, gram stain morphology alone. We will now take a look at the culture part itself. So if you do have one of your guides together, please bring that out and start looking through your Francisella, Brucella, and Burkholderia mallei. I think one test that really will help us as well, it's not a test, but just an observation again, and that is the fact that this organism, if you look at the gram negative, I don't have this particular slide in the Nebraska bench guide, but it has been fairly recently released in the APHL guide, which is also on our website. So I kind of recommend that you use both of these, and I think they'll be a great help. I hope someday to get enough money to add this slide, because this slide is really, really useful. So when you have a slow growing gram-negative coccobacilli or small rod, the first thing you can do is look at your growth on McConkeys. And that, you know, instead of relying on, okay, can I tell from the gram stain if it's coccobacilli or rod, which, as you know, can be very difficult to do. I think something more reliable is to look at your McConkey plate. So either there was no growth or very poor growth on your McConkey, or there was very good growth on your McConkey. And what's even more notable, if you look, anything that did grow on McConkeys is probably your gram-negative rod side. So I didn't happen to mention on the summary pages, after the gram-negative coccobacilli summary page, we have a summary page for the gram-negative rods, the ones that are truly gram-negative. And that would be your Burkholderia pseudomallei and your Yersinia pestis. Beyond that, if you can rule any of those two organisms out, or three organisms, you can take it back to the bench guide. Or excuse me, to the bench itself, and feel comfortable with working on the bench. All right, so tell me, by what you knew from our last slide, I'll go back, which of those two groups would you put them in? Gram-negative rod or gram-negative diplococci? And why? just to help out. If you're looking what your growth was, and that's why it's important to document it on your worksheet. You had tiny growth on what? Your blood and chocolate. So what does that tell you? Which group should it be? No growth on McConkey, or did you have good growth on McConkey? Right. There was no growth on the McConkey plate. So thank you for defining that. So no growth on McConkey will put you down into that area called the gram-negative coccobacilli. And again, that does assist with paring it down to just these 3 organisms. Okay. So another great little fact to remember. All right. So according to the LRN protocol, what testing is needed? Once you're in that biosafety cabinet, what are some of the tests we can do? All right, start going through your 3 organisms. And maybe what might help here is let's go back again to the summary page and talk about this. On sheep and blood for Francisella, we can have initial growth on blood, especially if it comes from a blood culture, and usually there's no growth on a subculture, which at this scenario we don't know yet because they have not subcultured it. But if you try to subculture it and it does not grow on chocolate, which is something that is has cysteine, then it might be your Francisella. Your chocolate, it was the same story. If you have blood culture nutrients that you are carrying over to your blood plate, it would grow on the blood. So what I'm trying to say is that if this was not a blood culture and was not carrying over rich nutrients, then more than likely that this organism requires cysteine and before it will grow. And Francisella normally does not grow on the chocolate plate. All right. However, if we were considering the organism Brucella, Brucella also is slow growers, no growth usually at 24, but can be smooth, convex, non-pigmented, and non-hemolytic at 48. But it has that same exact growth on the chocolate plate, as does the Burkholderia. Again, a no growth usually at 24, but it's a grayish translucent organism at 48 hours. Sometimes it may not even grow at 48, and you could try putting it to 48 or to 42 degrees centigrade to assist with that clarification, but it grows the same on chocolate. So once again, just talking about Francisella, if it does grow on chocolate, it's going to be extremely tiny, and it's not going to grow as well as it does on the blood plate. So if you have better growth on blood than chocolate, you could suspect that Francisella. So I don't know if that helps. Now we just need to talk about what biochemicals to do with that. All right, so I'm going to go back again to that original slide, and we're asking, okay, what biochemicals can we do? Do any of you have a book with you that you could look up, or do you have, you could maybe have your screen and do the presentation on one side, and then on the other side look at your If you go to NPHL, yeah, you can look at your browser and bring up your browser to NPHL at, nphl.org. And under BT, you will see the guides. And maybe I will do that right now. So with that, I'm going to change my screen and go back to my screen here. Hopefully you can see it. And what we're going to do is go to a new screen. I'm going to just bring up my browser and type in there nphl.org. It comes up for me. And looking at your left-hand side, go under preparedness, and under preparedness is two listings, biological and chemical. So under biological, under those LRN protocols, click there, you will see the different APHL bench guide and the NPHL bench guide. So bringing that up shows you those same summary pages as we just talked about. You go past the gram positives into your gram negatives, and here we are. So looking at the three of these, Francisella tells us to do an oxidase to catalase beta-lactamase. If you look at Brucella, what it tells us to do after the gram stain and after you've put it into the biosafety cabinet is, again, oxidase, catalase, and urease test. And then finally on your Burkholderia, after you've done those two things, then you would try an oxidase, a catalase, indol, urease, and motility. So by far, the Burkholderia tends to be the most involved. So let's go back to all three of these. What do you see as a common factor that should be done first? What test would you start with? May I recommend? Yes, thank you. It is probably that oxidase is the first test that's going to be really helpful, and then your catalase. So let's review. Your Francisella is going to be oxidase negative, your Brucella is going to be oxidase positive, and your B. malii is going to be oxidase variable. So that's not going to be very helpful. However, let's look at your catalase. Your catalase, and again, remember, we always do tube catalases on these types of organisms, and you're still in the biosafety cabinet. Because it's such an aerosolizing procedure, you'll definitely want to do the tube method. And that we described as you simply take your, one of those little polystyrene tubes, that holds about 2 mils. You'll put a couple drops of your hydrogen peroxide, and before you put your organism into the fluid, you would pick a couple of the colonies up with your loop or just a wooden stick, put it and rub it onto the side of the vessel, the inside of the vessel. Do not put it into the liquid. You then cap your tube, tip the tube so that the liquid then runs from the bottom over this organism, and that will give you your reaction. So Francisella is known to be tube catalase weak positive, but you know, it depends upon how much organism you use. So especially in the tube methodology, you could use a lot of organism and it will look like a very strong positive. If you were to do a catalase for brucella, it's going to be positive. And then with B. mallei, it's also going to be positive. So I guess that isn't the best one to rule out. We might have to depend upon other things, but at least with our oxidase, we can rule out at least one of these, right? All right. So if I were to, maybe I'll move this slide over. And, oops. Okay, and then I'm going to go back to my presentation here. All right, so if I turned it over and you've decided that the best test to do in the biosafety cabinet is oxidase, if I told you that oxidase was negative, now tell me, which organism have we ruled out? And if you think about those three, yes, you have ruled out brucella. Isn't that great? I mean, that's one less organism that you have to worry about. So brucella is ruled out, and we know that our francisella is oxidase negative, and our B. mallei can be iffy, so we're going to have to rely on a couple other tests to assist. Now, if I also told you catalase is weak positive, that's not really going to help because all of them are catalase positive. So right from there, I think that we are suspicious already, maybe for francisella. So the other test that you're going to want to do is that beta-lactamase test. But I have to ask you all a question. Do you have beta-lactamase in your laboratories? Is that a test that you could do? While you're typing yes or no, I want to share that this is an organism we get probably anywhere from a half a dozen to a dozen times a year, especially this time of year and when it's tick season. It's been kind of dry lately, but spring was a little wet. If we ever get another monsoon or wet season, these ticks might come out even more so. So I'm glad to hear that you all have it. That is something, though, that for other laboratories that do not carry beta-lactamase, I could provide on a bi-yearly, or not bi-yearly, biannual basis, meaning like every time I send out BT media, I could include that. But you just have to let me know. I would be happy to provide beta-lactamase, probably about 3 or 4 discs if you need them at a time, and just have to call me when you need more. Okay, great, thank you. So that beta-lactamase is extremely helpful. I think you all know how to do the beta-lactamase test, but I'm going to go back to one other, oops, I went the wrong way. One more slide here. I want to talk again. I may not have made too much sense when I was talking about francisella being dependent on cysteine. So normally francisella, if it were say a swab or a tissue that was sterile, of course, more than likely you would only put a small loop of that tissue grinding material onto the medius. There in that tissue itself, there's probably not cysteine that has come from the body. It probably would only normally grow on the blood plate. In this I know in this particular scenario, I had growing on blooded chocolate, and so that might not quite have made sense, but this is just a scenario. However, if you have a chocolate that is growing, more than likely it's because it's a blood culture. And as you might know, blood cultures are supplemented with cysteine, and therefore it does allow growth. Now, how do we rule this out from, say, Haemophilus influenza? Some of you might try an X and V plate. It would be possible to do what's called the satellite test. Now, the satellite test, the only reason I bring it up is because it's on the APHL book as recommended. Not many people have even been taught this in school anymore because it's really an old-fashioned method. And what they're doing is they're taking just a plain blood plate, and they take their unknown organism and they flocculently swab the whole entire plate, just back and forth. All right, so that what we're doing is we're looking to see if this organism requires cysteine to grow. Okay, so we're now adding staph. After you've done that, covered the whole plate with your unknown, you then take known staph, like your QC Staph aureus, go ahead and add it to the plate, and just in a line form, and then incubate these plates overnight. When you look at it the next day, you will either see good growth only in the area that NAD and cysteine were growing. And then on the other side of it, you would see absolutely no growth up to that particular streak. So this is telling you that this organism does not need, is not dependent upon X and V, and therefore this was probably are unknown, whereas this was probably Haemophilus, which is dependent upon the NAD and the cysteine. So an old test, you could try it, but we don't normally recommend it because, again, you're manipulating the colony quite a bit. You're doing a lot of extra work. We want just a couple really fast, quick tests. Okay. So let me go through real briefly on the epidemiology of Francisella. If you're any sort of outdoorsman, a hunter, or work in a veterinarian lab, you've heard of it before. It's something that is also known as tularemia, or a hunter might know it as rabbit fever. We've seen it in Nebraska various times. And the way a person comes exposed to it is that they have had some exposure to the environment. It could be that they're handling tissue from an infected animal. So when are they handling the tissue? It's simply because maybe they've trapped an animal and they're skinning it. Or inhalation of infected aerosols. Rabbits and lawnmowers are a deadly combination. There have been more cases in Nebraska, people, lawnmowers, professional lawnmowers, mowing lawns and running over a rabbit, which then sprayed right into their face. So if you want to talk about what safety measures, I would highly recommend that lawnmowers put on goggles and masks during their particular job. Also, it could be the bite of a tick, or it could be a flea. So, and if you remember, dogs and cats that tend to be outdoor animals sometimes, especially on the farm. They could be bitten by the fleas and ticks and unfortunately come down themselves with the organism. So we've even had a situation where a therapy dog was positive and gave this disease to an older woman who never went outside, but had visited the therapy dog that came into her nursing unit. So a wild story. She survived, but it's not a fun disease. Now, this does have a very low infective dose. Its incubation really varies, kind of widespread. Averages 3 to 5 days, but it can be a month before, almost a month before that person comes down with them. The duration of the disease may take about 2 weeks. If they're treated, usually that duration is limited. And if the patient goes untreated, the disease could be fairly moderate, and definitely not fun to have. The thing to remember is this organism is not contagious. And do you remember, like Bacillus anthracis? I reminded people that this is an important fact, because if these people are hospitalized, you don't have to be scared to work with them, because these are organisms that are not, even Bacillus anthracis is not contagious person to person. So all good information to know, because that will help in the diagnosis. So Francisella can come in many forms. Not only would you see it, say, in some sort of ulcer form, so you've got a bite, a scratch, or something. You'll have an ulcer that comes up on the finger or the hand. Or if it is a glandular, you might have some microabrasions. We have, interestingly enough, had some ocular glandular, meaning it's direct contamination to the eye. Once again, that spraying is an issue. And it's really a rare way to get Francisella, but we've seen a lot of it. Not a lot, but some cases in Nebraska. It can also be oral pharyngeal, as I didn't hit upon that in my last particular slide. It says eating and drinking of contaminated foods. Yikes. So it can be problematic there. And even pneumonic. So if it goes systemic, or if you've inhaled it, it definitely has gone into your lung system, and it eventually becomes systemic, like it does on this last point. So it can easily be treated with very simple antibiotics. But if they don't recognize it right away, the person really suffers. Where can the person find these organisms? As I said, a lot of times hunters and trappers are out in the wild, and especially if they are hunting around the area of Missouri and Arkansas, that's extremely high risk there. But also elsewhere, even Nebraska, Colorado, Wyoming, you'll see some amounts of it. Domestic animals, as I mentioned, can have it, and as well occupational hazard to laboratorians, because you work with the concentrated colonies, the farmers who work with the animals themselves, and the veterinarians who probably are doing biopsies on these animals. So all very good reason to wear your masks when you're working in the biosafety cabinet, in case it sprays through the, for some reason, sprays through the window part of the biosafety cabinet. Making sure you wear your mask and something to cover your eyes as well. All right. Um, this particular case was taken from a true case of a little boy who was bit by his pet hamster. And you can read through that case there. I believe that I may have saved that icon there. Oh, I think it's just the what we call the MMWR, and you can look up that dates issue. So I'm going to open it up and ask if you have any questions about those particular ones or this particular organism. All right, hearing none, I know that we are right at the top of the hour. So I give you two options. If you need to go back to lab, I totally understand. I am going to continue recording, and we're going to get through the other two. I usually don't take this long, but I think I went through it very slowly for all recording purposes. And so I'm now going to do case studies with the other two, and then talk a little bit about non-select agents. So if you need to hop off, feel free. But if you could stay on, that would be really awesome. Let me know if you're staying. And then meanwhile, I'll walk through the others. I think they'll go a lot faster. And I hope it doesn't take too much time here forth. So as I go on, we're going to go into case number 3. And if we, thank you, Tracy. If we keep going, we can see that we have probably a 38-year-old female that was admitted to adult ICU. So we know this is something probably fairly significant. It's not just a clinic patient that was sent home. And this patient was admitted. So what were some of the things that were of interest? The patient had a fever, malaise, respiratory failure, yikes. Now, whether you would have this history, I very much doubt it, but this is a true case, so I thought I would share it with you. The history of this patient is that there was possible exposure to lab flasks and cultures that were kept in their apartment by a boyfriend. This is what the patient told the doctor, and the doctor then became extremely suspicious. So looking at the second box, we see it is a blood culture. It was collected and sent down to the lab, say at day 1, but if you look at from the 19th to the 23rd, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, this is 4 days growth in blood culture. So that's very significant. And when they did the gram stain, I'm going to show you what that gram stain looked like. The gram stain also had no, the original direct gram stain had no organism seen. So, you know, blood cultures do this on occasion. Sometimes if they have too many white blood cells, they might just spike and the flag is, the bell rings, it's detected as a possible positive, and if there's no organism seen, what you might do is literally subculture it and put it back into the blood culture system. That's anyway what they write and recommend you do for anything where there's supposedly nothing in the gram stain. So you've returned it to the back tech. This is day 4. And if we go on, we see that the blood culture was no growth at 24 hours. And I think that was mentioned. No, I didn't here, but on the requisition. But let's say at 24, or excuse me, at day 5, which would be 24 hours of growth on the plate, it must have been negative. And then if you think about it, a lot of times bottles are tossed at day 5. because they're negative. However, you should have some means by which these particular ones that are falsely flagged, that you retrieve them anyway. A lot of times they're simply incubated separately in maybe a different incubator instead of putting them back into the blood culture machine. They might be incubated again with the plates themselves as they subculture, so that they're not thrown away at day 5. So what are the trigger points? Obviously, again, that slow growth and that sterile site should be your clues for sure. Okay. So if you then saw a tiny growth at 48 hours, you went to gram stain it, and you saw this. What would you think about this one? And I don't know if any of you would be interested in helping out here, Macy or Hannah, and who else? Christina, if you're still with us too. Give me your first initial thought, if you can. Hannah is out, so it just looks like you, Macy. That's fine if you're so willing to. Yeah, well, it does. It looks like a gram variable coccobacilli, and that's very true. So let's think back to those pages. Thank you for helping there. That we, oh, let me maybe do this. I'll go back and see if I can't change my sharing screen, which would be this one. And now I'm going to go back to my book, and I want to go to the summary actually. So if you think about it, so Francisella is very hard to read, so tiny you can't see the slides. But if you read up on Brucella, Brucella is a small gram-negative rod, may be slow to decolorize, can appear as gram-positive cocci. That should be your big clue that it is, yeah, that it is possibly a brucella. Now, can it be B. malii? Well, you can't rule it out. You're really not always sure. Again, you shouldn't depend wholly on the morphologies. And the B. malii says that it may have rounded edges, wavy sides, parallel bundles. I don't think we see this. In fact, one of the things I've seen in another chart is that for the brucella, that it's single, small gram-negative coccobacilli laying in singles. And you can see these organisms, at least you can see that there's something there. It doesn't just look like junk like Francisella, but at least you can see singles of the organisms. It's the gram, a lack of decolorizing and the gram variableness that's really going to confuse you. And it might confuse you to the fact that you could accidentally call this gram a strep. Some people have accidentally called this a strep variant. The strep variants are slow growers. They gram stain something similar to this because strep decolorizes, and so they thought that they were working with a slow growing streptococcus. Nowhere in the sight of thinking of this as a BT organism. Okay, well, let me go back one more time and to share our slide again. So hopefully you can see the gram stain now that I've shared. And I think I have to go back this way. Okay, so if you're not, please text me on the chat box that you're not seeing it. But so If you're thinking of this organism, hopefully at this point you feel that you need to repeat the gram stain. You know that you have to do it in the biosafety cabinet because it's a slow grower. And on that biosafety cabinet, if I told you it was oxidase positive, and what other test can we do? Catalase positive, but the catalase wasn't very helpful, was it? And I had recommended you set up a urease, and that your urease was rapidly positive. That would definitely rule out Francisella and probably even the Burkholderia mallei. So what do we mean by rapid positive urea? What we're recommending, I have a procedure for this rapid urea test. We do use the BT tubes, and what we recommend is you take it out of the refrigerator, you warm it up in your little paws, or put it in an incubator for 5 minutes so that it gets to a warm temperature. It's not refrigerator cold still. So then you want to inoculate it, inoculate the slant only, and inoculate it as heavy as you can make it. Put it in your 37-degree incubator again, and say maybe at an hour, 2 hours, and again 3 hours. You can double check if yours was inoculated heavy enough. You're going to see some very faint pink showing up even within a half an hour or an hour. And it would look like this. Only the streak would be positive, but at least that's a clue that it's positive. If you leave it for a full 20, if you don't see that right at first, you do need to re-incubate it for a full 24 hours. And if you see it at 24 hours, you can still call it a brucella. So again, observe that rapid urease. It says in our book, you could take a peek at 15 minutes or 30 minutes, definitely at 2 hours, and then again at 24 hours. All right. So what is brucella? Brucella is a disease of infected animals. It causes brucellosis. Again, Nebraska is not immune to this particular disease because we have seen it, but rarely. It is not a yearly thing. In fact, I think that's why Nebraska, in the state of Nebraska, all our cattle are vaccinated with a vaccine called the RB51, which is a brucella species 51 attenuated, so that our cattle in our state can be immune to this organism. What we worry about are brucellas somehow gaining resistance to this organism, even though the cattle might be vaccinated, that they still grow. We have not seen that in America yet. Our problem with brucella usually stems from someone who has visited from Mexico, and they there do not vaccinate their cattle herds, often bring back milk or cheese, unpasteurized cheese, or other dairy products back to the States and to share with their family. And if that is contaminated with brucella, then yeah, it's definitely a problem. So it can be seen in our cattle, our pigs, our goats, our sheep, and even our dogs, our domestic dogs. It can be inhaled. You have a cow that has it, you know, sneezes all over you as you're out in the pasture. Yeah, you definitely can get it. So this organism has a very slow incubation day. I mean, you can see it as soon as 5 days, but it tends to take months. And then people don't remember where they were at 3 months ago to realize, oh, maybe it was something I got when I was out in the pasture. The duration takes weeks to months. It takes very little organism, so it has a low infectivity rate. And really, it's not something that people die from, but they have very bad flu-like symptoms. They have a fever, fatigue, anorexia, excuse me, and arthritis. Again, not a person-to-person transmission, and the mortality rate is very slow, and it's easily treated with penicillins. Or penicillins, or is it the tetracyclines? I don't remember necessarily, but I know it's easily treated. And those are common antibiotics that can be used. So the trick is this: flu-like symptoms, fever, fatigue, and unfortunately with this disease, it comes and goes. So somebody who has this may have it again at 3 months, again at 6 months. They can't figure out what's wrong. They keep having it. And unfortunately, if it goes on long enough, they never get rid of these symptoms. It continues throughout their life that they have these undulating symptoms of the brucellosis. So not a fun organism to have. The real important thing, well, we'll get to it. I want to also list that as a laboratorian, do know that there are 4 different species. I think 3 of the 4 are rapid urease positive organisms that you would catch right away, but that B. canis might not necessarily be positive. Urease may not be positive right away. All right. So once again, it is an organism that is found to go septic, and it is found not even in the lymph node system, but also in the bone marrow itself. And that's what it happens. It gets into the bone marrow. It presents itself just on occasion when you're stressed or tired, and the symptoms come forth again. So it can cause other types of problems. It can be seen in the spleen, liver, simply because it's spread since it's gone systemic, or even some sort of abscesses. On occasion, doctors may even to this day call you and ask you to incubate your blood cultures for a full 21 days. They know that you only normally hold them for 5. And if they're suspectant of brucellosis, this is a farmer or a vet person, they might ask you to hold it for a full 21. From my experience, I don't think that is necessary anymore, but I would still continue to follow the physician's recommendations. I think what you'll find is that these organisms will grow very nicely in the blood culture within those 5 days. And the reason is now is because those blood cultures are so much better and more nutritious than they ever have been. If you accidentally try to identify this, which we do not recommend ever putting on an automated system, because then your laboratory will have a possible exposure at that point. It can be even misidentified. And so that's why it's so important never to put a slow growing organism on your moldy top or your Vitek or anything like that, because first of all, it misidentifies it anyway, because it doesn't have those kinds of organisms in their database. And it just is, some of these organisms are then, the enzymatic reactions are so few, they just can't identify it very well. So with that, do be careful. Some of these organisms are also rapid urease producers. And so what we ask is you totally discontinue working with this organism and send it to the Nebraska Public Health Laboratories, where we can work with it in a BSL-3 setting. All right. So here is the resources for that case study. It was a person It was a true story. Somebody who had a hospital personnel, oops, sorry, apparently had taken it home and was growing it in flasks and cultures at home. And the family members actually reported him to the FBI. And as you know, this looks very suspicious to the FBI, and this person probably may have been charged with, or at least arrested for possible BT violations. So interesting situation. I will definitely go on here. The one thing I think I forgot to add, though, about Brucella is that this is probably one of the most dangerous organisms to you as a laboratorian. And the reason I say this is some of the data out there says that a laboratorian is over 600 times more at risk of working with cultures with Brucella than, say, a farmer, a veterinarian who works with a cow that has this organism, simply because we work with it. And people in the laboratory have become sick and have come down with this organism and wasn't able to figure it out right away, maybe a year down the road. We don't want this to happen to you. Unfortunately, they had worked on it. No, the one particular case I can think of, they hadn't even worked on this organism. It was a lab partner who did work right next, the next chair over, and probably you did something to aerosolize, and that person the laboratorian who was not even working on it did come down with it. So. All right, the last case I'm going to try to fly through here real quickly. It is going to be an organism that will be difficult also for us to handle. But if you review again the patient criteria, that this is a 16-year-old who fell off a trampoline. So it was seen in the ER. We don't know if they maybe were dismissed or is in ICU at this point. You could certainly look that up. But chills, fever, vomiting, respiratory arrest. So they actually did a spinal tap on this patient. And then the spinal fluid, if you look at this at cultured on the 21st, on the 22nd, it did have small growth. Blood, chocolate, and non-lactose fermenting on the McConkeys. So right there, I mean, the one organism you might think of as, because if you remember by our summary charts, that it's the Burkholderias that grow on the McConkeys. But if we look at the gram stain of this, you'll see it's a gram-negative rod, very distinctly gram-negative rod. Shouldn't be any problem to identify this one, right? And so if it's a gram-negative rod, if it's growing on McConkeys, that tells you this is probably truly a gram-negative rod. And what are the two things that you need to consider? Probably going back to your summary pages, and I will not do it this time, but if you do it, the two organisms that you have to be concerned about are your Yersinia pestis and your Burkholderia pseudomallei, which is a true gram-negative rod already. Unfortunately, both those organisms in the gram stain summary page also describe themselves as bipolar staining. Now this slide, if you look close enough, and I know it's really hard on an image of sorts, but maybe you could say, well, this does look kind of right here, a bipolar. Looks like safety pin where the ends kind of stain a little bit larger. Now here you can see where they kind of lay in bundles to each other. So that could be a clue just in the gram stain, right? This is not going to be a helpful clue if you actually kept this organism for 3 or more days, it might start looking to something like what we would describe as a fried egg appearance. Again, looking on the left-hand image, you'll see this is just a kind of a iridescent, smooth organism that is growing and then growing as a non-lactose fermenter on the McConkeys. So both organisms can be bipolar, both organisms can grow on McConkey. So really it's going to have to be the biochemicals that will help us rule these out. So what biochemicals? It's going to be that oxidase and that catalase again that's going to really help you. So trigger points, the fact that maybe this is not such a slow grower though, it came at 24 hours. It's oxidase negative, and then you look on the chart and you'll see that your your Burkholderia is oxidase positive. Well, that makes sense because Burkholderia was once a Pseudomonas. Pseudomonases are always oxidase positive. So now the only thing you're thinking of at this point is your Yersinia, and it's oxidase negative. And then looking at the chart, indol, which you can do just like a spot indol, is recommended, and then you would be able to do that as a rapid test. The problem is that this fits Enterobacter ACEs. All the enterics are oxidase negative, glucose positive, indol. Some of them are indol negative. So it's tough to say. If I were working with this organism, I might not have questioned it. I might have just put it on the commercial ID systems. Now, it's an inert organism, so it might also be misidentified as any of these listed here. But if you review under Yersinia pestis, that the tube catalase is positive, but I think both of them are. Your indol is negative, your urease is negative. What's going to be the helpful division is this tube motility. So that tube motility we recommend doing at both 25 and 35 degrees. So you're going to do 2 motilities, relieving, and the QC. So you're going to do 4 tubes in general, and leave one of the tubes at room temp, one in the incubator. So that will define our Yersinia pestis because they're negative for both temperatures, whereas most other organisms might grow or be motile at 24 or at 35 degrees or maybe room temperature. So just a reminder, this organism, it can easily be misidentified, and one of them that came to fruition, a laboratory did identify it as a Pseudomonas, or I'm sorry, Yersinia pseudotuberculosis. And thank God they questioned the ID, and they decided to go ahead and perform a rule out and refer on it. They were not able to refer it out, so they considered sending it to NPHL. I mean, I suppose you could consider doing an API or rapid NH system if you really wanted to. These are systems that you could do in the biosafety cabinet. They take another 24 hours. Well, the rapid NH only 4 hours. But that's not something we recommend. I would say just do the motility. That's the least amount of manipulation with the organism. And you'll see that the organism grows equally at 25 and 35. And that's something important to note, that if like if on your stool bench, you do grow, if you do stool bench, that you'll have one plate that grows at 35, maybe possibly looking for specifically for Yersinia, and it's going to grow at both, whereas most other organisms do not grow at 25. So that room temp McConkey or CIN plate will not be growing. So you know that it's not a Yersinia. Again, like I said, it's a little gray-white translucent colony, becomes kind of irregular, almost hammered shaped. But again, by then you don't hold the culture long enough to really work with it. This organism causes what we know as bubonic plague, sometimes known as pneumonic plague. Bubonic because the buboes literally kind of rise from your skin area and stick out. Whereas with pneumonic, it hits the lung area. It is a zoonotic disease, again, in your domestic dogs and cats, but you also see it in ground squirrels. And what do we have in Nebraska? We have a ton of prairie dogs. So it's not something you want to go out and play in the prairie dog field because they are at high risk to Yersinia pestis. Now, this particular organism is seen in the Four Corners states, in California, Oregon, southern part of that state too, and I've heard of many situations where many of the particular hunters that went down there take their dog down there and then slept with their, sleep in the cabins with their dogs and then come down with it themselves. What's more unrealistic is something we don't see anymore. If you remember, the plague that hit back in the 1300s was also Yersinia pestis. It caused what was called the Black Death. The Black Death has a very high infective dose rate, very short incubation time, and a lot of times it came from infected fleas or infected droplets with the infected animals. But even then, I think it was in the water, and that's how they initially found it, because they found that when some of our early epidemiologists started literally mapping or doing what we call contact tracing, they found it was always around one particular well. And that person might have used the well that particular day. So if you look at the images that do show the buboes or the lymph nodes that stick out in a person where the disease is that bad, and to the point where their fingertips and their toes became black, hence the Black Death. They just didn't have any circulation. That's why it turned black, because they didn't have circulation. Their lymph nodes were so clogged with these organisms that they didn't have good circulation. So a lot of them did die of lack of good circulation. Mortality is really high. It can be up to 60% if untreated. Back then they didn't have antibiotics. Today we do, and that's why we don't see it nearly as much. You can kind of read the little scenario there about some of the stories that occurred in the Middle Ages, but we have had some recent scenarios, and that has happened as late as the 1970s, where we've had epidemics in Vietnam and some of the third world countries. And if I'm not mistaken, today there's, I say the 70s, but I know that there's been some epidemics even today in the 2020. So, okay, all right. So toward the end here, we're just going to fly through these, and thank you for sticking with here to get through the end of this, and then we will be done. There's some more cases. I think I started alluding to this earlier. There was a laboratory who had a blood culture and had identified or had sent the first one to a commercial laboratory, and they identified it as luteola. And yet that same lab had another blood culture that was positive, and they decided to test it themselves by their Vitek. Vitek identified it as a Yersinia pseudotuberculosis. So the microbiologists were very, very keen to realize that, and became suspicious that there were discrepancies between the two labs, and decided to call the public health lab and sent it in. And yes, it was identified as Yersinia pestis, but as you can imagine, you've got two laboratories with exposures here. So that is a very problematic thing with these kinds of organisms. This particular story did come fairly recently. I think it was 2000, oh, I don't remember, 2019, 2016. We had a case in Colorado, and you can read through that, that whole story too. Other select agents, just briefly talking about Burkholderia pseudomallei. This one, remember, is the one that grows on the McConkey but is oxidase positive. The organism causes something called amyloidosis. Very fatal, rapidly fatal too. It occurs in areas that are tropical, where there's a lot of water. You can think of places, especially in Asia, Central America, they grow rice, and this is where this organism is keenly found. But it's usually from direct contact from this environment. And you can see here it mapped out where it's extremely endemic, and they still to this day are concerned with this disease state. Many of our Vietnam vets that came back in the 1950s and 60s, in the 1960s or early 70s, excuse me, did come down with this organism. And in fact, they even found that they could get the disease, it would reactivate itself up to 20 years later after that very first infection. We have seen it very rarely, but on occasion in the United States. This was kind of a tricky one where a laboratory exposure happened from working with a sputum of an 8-year-old with cystic fibrosis in Rhode Island. So what are you thinking? Yeah, you're cystic fibrosis, you're thinking of Burkholderia, what's the one in cystic fibrosis? Well, anyway, forgive me. One of them is seen if it's cystic fibrosis, but it was not the pseudomallei. It's the, oh, again, I still can't think of it. Thank you anyway. Oh, Cepacia, thank you, Macy. I appreciate it. So it is definitely the Burkholderia cepacia that they figured they had, and then working with it, couldn't get it identified, then discovered that it was a BT organism. All right, so glad you hung in here. Here's a good direct gram stain of this organism. This really truly shows the bipolarness of this gram stain. But again, this is not a reliable identification. You can't just call it from this. You do have to go through some of the biochemicals. Interestingly enough, this organism too is kind of weird looking on the McConkey plate. It can be definitely very tiny at first, and with growth, very weird, different colors. Trigger points for pseudomallei, we just mentioned. We do recommend following your flowchart, your LRN flowchart, and therefore doing the oxidase and the indole. And the thing that you will notice even before, and hopefully you haven't even opened it up, but with a closed plate, you will distinctly smell an earthy, musty, very strong odor. So obviously you can't open the plates, especially at benchside, to sniff it. You should be able to smell it right through that closed plate. And there's the follow through, very dry colony. Again, it almost can be very wrinkly on the plate given time. So if you have anything that looks faintly suspicious and you're not giving it, you know, you've been working with it for several days, please call the public health lab. Another organism is Burkholderia mallei. This is the one that fits into the gram-negative coccobacilli. It is an organism I've never seen before. It's extremely rare. Causes glanders in horses. And if you think back to World War I, they used a lot of livestock. And so it was a highly communicable disease back then. They fought this at times. In fact, this was used by the enemy to infect their opponents' whole herd. So if you kill out the herd, you don't have a way to move forward back in World War I to carry their equipment and such. So, and a person can come down with it too. Again, if you're in North Africa, Middle East, those endemic areas, you can come down with a localized cutaneous sore. You can come down with a pulmonary type disease. It becomes septic or can become chronic. Ultimately, it's extremely fatal, 95% if not treated. So that's why it's extremely important to catch it as soon as possible. So it's a slow grower, but yeah, I wouldn't mess with it too much, even at 48 hours. Here, again, we recommend always following the LRN chart. Why do we push the LRN charts? Why don't we just say, well, there's this one full chart at the end that shows you all the reactions? Why not follow that? Well, because then you start doing certain testing that's not necessary, that could be, again, a risk to you. And so we do not encourage you to use just alternate tests, charts. We recommend you go straight to the LRN flow chart. Do only those type of tests that are recommended, and leave it as that, and call the public health lab if you are not able to rule out. So this is a new age of microbiology, especially with these slow growers. It tends to be problematic. We've got a lot of instrumentation that you could try to use. Some people will even argue that it's safe to do, that you can do the spot testing in your biosafety cabinet. You can cover it with a matrix, but research has not been done to prove that. And so again, we don't recommend doing any of these methodologies until someday it has been proven. Until that time, we recommend that if you have slow growth, that you maybe immediately take to the biosafety cabinet, use only the LRN methods, and call the public health laboratory. Quickly, I want to just talk briefly about other hazardous organisms to the laboratorian. Neisseria meningitidis is very risky to the laboratorian. You guys know how to identify this. You know what it looks like. It's a very nice diplococci. The point is you really want to consider working even with this organism in the biosafety cabinet. If you're going to set up an NH rapid kit, do it in the biosafety cabinet. If you accidentally aerosolize that liquid, it gets on your hands, you rub it on your faces, you could come down with it. It could be a matter I hate to say this, but life and death, because it's happened before. You know the stories about children who get it from, you know, the dorms and things like that. They die within 24 hours. It can happen to a laboratorian too. So do definitely work with it as safely as you can. And we even have a particular chart, LRN chart, that you can follow that. Do you know that Mycobacterium tuberculosis is also a hazard in the laboratory? You should only be working this up in the BSL-3. I think a majority of laboratories were at one time trying to work them up in their regular BSL-2 class where they normally were, or their BSL-2 laboratory. But they aren't following through with the BSL-3 precautions of wearing the N95 mask, wearing the eye goggles or face masks. So if you can't do that, you have to send it into a laboratory that can identify it in a BSL-3 setting. All right. There's a lot of unusual pathogens. There's a list right here. Some of them we've mentioned, things I won't talk about at all today. Coxiella, staph enterotoxin B, all of those are mentioned on our websites, especially the ASM website, that talk about biological threats. In fact, one thing I encourage all laboratories to do is to print out this guide for their setups area. This is a reference guide that if they get a call from a physician and says, we think we have a patient with anthrax, what specimens would you recommend? You get a lot of those questions, right, as a laboratorian. So you can look this up and you can tell them, well, they can, you know, send in cutaneous material. If they think they have an eschar, they can send in gastrointestinal fluids. Or if they think it's a gastrointestinal presentation, they can send in stool or blood to the laboratory. And if they think it's inhalation, they would recommend a sputum and a blood culture be sent in. So I highly, again, recommend that you put this at your setups so that even the people at the front desk, they get a call, they know how to answer it. Why are we seeing these diseases nowadays? Why are they resurging or emerging like COVID did? If you think about it, they're changing world in essence. We have a changing ecosystem. Our weather's changing drastically. Our food production is becoming more massive and less sterile conditions. We have a lot of new evolutionary medical devices that can become contaminated. We have a lot more people that are immunosuppressed, and who knows if the very laboratory coworker you're working with is immunosuppressed, and they could be on they could have rheumatoid arthritis or lupus, and you would never know it. So these people too need to be aware that if they're working in these labs, it truly is a risk to them, especially the intracellular organisms. And then, of course, the reason I teach this class is because we're always concerned about the misuse of the organism, that it can be used specifically for biocrime and bioterrorism. Organisms like this also can result in human intervention and that's what happens when we have antibiotic pressure. They become more resistant. And as we have found out with COVID, it jumps species barriers. It has gone to person, and that's when it becomes a pandemic. I don't have a whole lot of information on COVID right now, but even in the novel influenzas, we've always been concerned about it. So therefore, what the public health department has done is set up surveillances, and I suspect that we will be doing this as well for COVID, that in the future we will want to see where COVID is popping up. We're setting up certain types um, of surveillance testing. And what that means is that at the beginning of the fall season, which is the beginning of the season for influenza, we're going to send out to doctors and clinics and hospitals collection kits, which is also the nasal pharyngeal swab, and then send them just automatically to MPHL. We can be the first ones to do that testing to see if there's anything unusual in the community. And so we would be the first to know about it. Other novel, influenza, I think you know how it's identified, of course, through its proteins, and that's how we can characterize it as their H and their N proteins. They go through that point mutation or even reassortment to get a major shift into the types of diseases. So again, our pandemic plans, no matter if they're influenza, if they're COVID, or possibly even Ebola, we hope that we have surveillance plans watching for these emerging pathogens. That is our whole scope as public health, to first catch these organisms. Oops, I'm sorry. And then to figure out a plan to try to keep it at bay. One last thing before we go, I wanted to talk about a little bit about rapid influenza, and now I'm going to mention rapid COVID testing, rapid strep testing, any of those, because these particular tests are definitely something to think about. They're done at bench side, they're done in the doctor's offices. We want to really watch what kind of testing is done and where this testing is done. And the reason I say this is because this image is not to inhibit you from doing certain types of testing. I mean, to say one commercial company is better than another. They all have about the same percentage of sensitivity. What I'm saying is that there is more contamination in these kinds of tests than working with bigger machines or whatever, because look at, even though you don't see it, look at, they put a fluorescent dye into and put a black light, and you can see in some of these more open card systems how much aerosolization there is. So even in a doctor's office, we recommend the full PPE, wearing the gloves, wearing something to protect your face and your eyes. If they would have a biosafety cabinet, which normally they don't in doctor's office, that's where it should be done. You as laboratorians sometimes do have the biosafety cabinets, and that's where we recommend, if you have to do these rapid tests, please do them in there. If you do not have a biosafety cabinet, then make sure you have some sort of desk splash guard, and you wear all the PPE as if you're in a BSL-2, but you're following up with BSL-3 precautions, and that is to wear all that extra PPE. All right, Ebola, we do have a program in place. Each laboratory does have a cooler that's only supposed to be used for the hemorrhagic viruses. Unfortunately, some people have used it for COVID. So we'll be doing more packaging and shipping training, but that is for transport of an Ebola virus that is a category A and very dangerous to transport. So we have a transport kit that looks like this, and I would do training with each laboratory as we go. You pretty much not only triple package it, but quadruple or package 10 times over just to make this organism safe. So in summary, I'd like to just remind you all as laboratorians to don't become complacent. Think every day about, I know you're in a hurry, you're busy, you've got so much work to do on your plate, but think about your step-to-step actions. Think about, okay, this is what I do next, and how safe is it? So always think trigger points. Always think about, well, this might fit this category. So if you cannot rule it out, discontinue what you've worked or what you've got so far, and let us finish working it up in our BSL-3. You first need to, before you send it to us, even notify the appropriate people. Make sure you kind of double check with your supervisor that this is what your plan of attack is, to send it to the public health. Make sure everybody's on board. Check if there were any open bench exposures. Sometimes CDC can be as blatant as just calling the opening of a plate and call that an exposure. That's debatable, but I do know that if you do any manipulation with the colony on the plate, that's definitely confirmed as an open exposure, and will have to be reported to the CDC by those forms that we talked about in session 1. So the point is that you want to practice your safety. You want to practice how to recognize these trigger points. How can you practice? You can do proficiency testing. You can either sign up for the LPX if you are a large lab. I highly recommend it. If you are a small lab and maybe don't do a whole lot of microbiology, I recommend the challenge set, or maybe even that, just the gram stain challenge that I have, so you can at least identify the anthrax that might be seen in your blood culture bottles. All right. With that, I'm going to leave you with a few more resources that will help you in doing your proficiency tests or your exercises, and always know that you can reach us. So with that, I would like to close the session with just saying thank you for being there for all 3 sessions. If you have any questions, just email them to karenstiles@unmc.edu. These will be followed up by, if you have verified that you've attended all 3 of these sessions, email that information and I will send you the PACE credits. So thank you all. Macy, if you're still on, I can give you your PACE number. If you're ready, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send it. Can you see it? Yeah. If you can still see your chat box, I'm going to put it into the chat box. So since you've watched today, go ahead, and your session code is, oops, this one. So use that session code, go ahead and write it down, or if you lose it, don't hesitate to call me, and you will be able to complete that and get your PACE credit. So, all right. I think you get the award for being at all of them. So thank you, and take care. Bye now.